continue with the Wilfrid Laurier soiree, we will today read the Wilfrid Laurier University's Rainbow Centres list of demands posted on Facebook, 23 hours from the time of this reading. The university has still not acknowledged the violence and transphobia that have been impacting trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse students, staff, and faculty for the past month. The university administration has yet to provide any formal recognition of the transphobia folks are experiencing on this campus and has not yet provided any additional safety measures or supports for those impacted. The Rainbow Centre has advocated for certain safety and support mechanisms in a meeting with upper administration, but none of our concerns have been recognized or implemented. This list of demands will serve to hold the institution publicly accountable to the needs of trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse students. Now, before the list of demands, we're going to go back up and look at that first sentence. The university has still not acknowledged the violence and transphobia that have been impacting these people. It's kind of hard to acknowledge something that hasn't really happened, other than language, right? So the framework for all these demands is that there are certain ways of thinking and certain ways of speaking that are, in fact, violence, which is hard to acknowledge, because even the acknowledgement has to come out through language, right? And maybe your language is going to be violence. So it'd be really doubly difficult to not perpetuate the violence if you don't know exactly how to acknowledge the violence with words. All right, demand number 1. Issue a public statement naming that transphobia is a problem at our institution that is impacting trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse students, staff, and faculty. We want Laurier to publicly acknowledge the ways trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse individuals are being harmed and commit themselves to challenging the systems of transphobia and cis-normativity in all of the university's endeavors. Hashtag name transphobia. Demand number 2. President Deb McLatchie must issue a public apology to trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse students, staff, and faculty for failing to acknowledge the transphobia that exists on our campus or provide adequate supports. So the first demand is acknowledgement, and then the second demand is the apology for not acknowledging whatever they want acknowledged. We want you to say that you are sorry for failing to uphold the experiences and safety of trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse people in the Laurier community, and for your complicity in maintaining transphobia. Now, one of the issues that I have with, not with trans rights, but trans rights activism is, in my experience reviewing the documents here and then the documents at Evergreen, they have a difficulty of specifying their terms. Their terms are themselves always in flux.
I am tired of feeling like my identity isn't valid enough to fit into the trans community because people keep using the asterisks, i.e. trans asterisk, after the word. I see it within the trans community at Evergreen, and there are so many reasons the asterisk is problematic, and all it takes to understand why it shouldn't be used is a simple Google search. I'm still pulling people into binaries by explaining this, which sucks, but I don't know how else to talk about it. But non-binary, assigned male at birth, masked people, and assigned female at birth, femme. Oh, okay. But non-binary, AMAB, masculine-presenting people, and AFAB, feminine people, or anyone that presents outside of how society views androgyny, aren't taken seriously by the trans community time and time again. Not to mention from those outside of the community. But it is important that we as trans people aren't creating hierarchies of transness. We are trans enough no matter how we present. We need to get rid of the idea of who is trans enough.
And transphobia is a big foundational concept for them, but here they refrain from specifying what they mean by transphobia. You kind of have to guess, and then you have to apologize for guessing wrong, then revise your apology, and then admit that you were wrong, and then acknowledge even further. It's kind of a perpetual regret machine that they want to institute. And then at the end of demand number 2, there's another hashtag. Hashtag say it, Deb. Demand number 3, immediately implement safety measures that have already... Demand number 3, immediately implement safety measures that have already been requested by the Rainbow Centre, including the installation of a panic button and reinforced windows in all DEO centres and offices. Create proactive safety processes in consultation with all members of the Diversity and Equity Office so that future safety concerns can be addressed immediately when threats to marginalized students occur. Now, I don't know if there's been any smashed windows in the first place. I haven't heard any reports of that. Secondly, this panic button that they want is literally for the thought police. If somebody says something that you disagree with, you run over to the panic button and you press it, a silent alarm sounds, because a unsilent alarm would probably be a macroaggression, and then all of a sudden these people show up and ridicule the person who disagrees with you. Demand number 4, postpone the task force on freedom of expression until proper consultation can be completed with students, staff, and faculty who have been impacted by recent events and specialize in human rights. Change the composition of the task force to include representatives from the Diversity and Equity Office, as well as specific requirements for trans people and people of color. Now, this number 4 demand is rather telling, because what's happened in Canada, for whatever reason, they have human rights laws. And for whatever reason, they have instituted language as a part of their human rights. So saying the wrong things, or even thinking the wrong things, is a violation of somebody's human rights. So in this example, in number 4, freedom of expression is secondary to human rights. And then subsequently, they want to staff the task force with people who agree with them or who will put certain sorts of language over and above freedom of expression. So it seems like they can't even see the tension between freedom of expression and this definition that Canada has of human rights. They don't even want to embark on sussing out that tension. They just want to implement their version of human rights, which I don't think will work for them in the long term, because a lot of their language and stuff is constantly in flux, like I said. So you're going to have people who are constantly updating the rules on what is offensive and what is inoffensive. I don't know if there's going to be a delay in how fast you can implement any given morphology of the language. You're always going to be playing catching up, and essentially you're always going to be in trouble. You're always going to be offending somebody or denying their very existence. Demand number 5. Hire a second full-time sexual violence response coordinator within the Diversity and Equity Office in order to help respond to the experiences of gender-based violence that are occurring on campus. That's really interestingly phrased. So they want to bolster the staff of their Diversity and Equity Office in order to help respond to the experiences of gender-based violence that are occurring on campus. Now, these experiences are highly subjective. And by subjective, I mean they are not a physical act of violence, they're an emotional or verbal act of violence, and they need help to respond to the experiences of such. This demand will increase the availability of supports to survivors of transphobia. Survivors of transphobia. That makes me think that all the spiders in my yard are survivors of arachnophobia. and all other forms of gender-based violence within an office that is grossly overworked and understaffed. Now, it might be that they are so grossly overworked and understaffed is because they have so broadly defined what they're trying to deal with that it's almost impossible to actually support the survivors of this. And this is something that I've been thinking about with privilege. Like if you want to reduce privilege or to equalize privilege, you're going to need a machine that can computate something that's almost incalculably complex. And the same thing with language. It's almost impossibly complex to actually root out whatever they're calling transphobia, because it has to do with language, right? And language is based on intention. And so with the Ontario Human Rights Code, now they're starting to litigate language, but what's language other than something that somebody intends? And so they need to start to police belief systems, and then they start to need to police behaviors, and they start to need to police emotions. So when you start to police a phobia, how can you root out a phobia? How can you root out a gut reaction or a belief system or some sort of feeling state? I don't think you possibly can, but they have the laws in place to be able to potentially to do this. Demand number 6. Hire a trans person of color as a full-time counselor within the Diversity and Equity Office to provide mental health supports to individuals who are being impacted by our campus climate. These people are being impacted by a climate. So not only are there microaggressions, but there are now vapor aggressions. The very air itself is exuding this gas that makes you cry, this tear gas of phobias. Furthermore, at the beginning, they want a trans person of color. Now, in the United States, at least federally, there are laws in place that disallow you from hiring somebody based on their external categories. And I don't know about Canada, but I see actually in American institutions of higher education, they are trying to get around that to work on their quotas. And that whole affirmative action thing is being rejiggered now to hire people based on their race and sexual orientation and their gender and so on and so forth. Which basically works out to just hire less white men. Basically, that's what they're doing in higher ed. But these people specifically want a trans person of color. So whether or not they're qualified hinges on the fact of their identity. Demand number 7. Establish a fund of at least $5,000 per year that can be accessed by all departments at Laurier so that faculty, staff, and teaching assistants can access trans education workshops and pay trans and non-binary facilitators. This fund should be overseen by the Diversity and Equity Office, who can coordinate facilitators through the Rainbow Centre or other community organizations. So basically, they want more positions for their group, and then they want more resources for their group, and then they want to be able to control the resources for their ideology. A lot of these campus activist centers, these lounges, and these various different studies, these different kind of identity study groups, they were all created in response to perceived oppression or in response to perceived gaps of equity. So their very existence hinges on oppression, and it hinges on marginalization. So when the larger marginalizations, over time disappear, then they need to constantly create an atmosphere of oppression in order to keep on doing their work. Like I said earlier about anti-oppression workshops, the one thing that anti-oppression workshop needs is oppression. It feeds on oppression, not the diminishment of oppression, because once oppression is diminished, then they run out of a reason for being. Their whole ontological being is founded upon the fact that oppression matters and that we need to dissolve oppression, but then they would dissolve themselves. So it's kind of a trap that they're in. And you see this working out here, and you'll see it working out at other institutions that have these sorts of activist-oriented departments. Demand number 8. hire a trans faculty member to serve as a Canadian research chair on transphobia in post-secondary educational institutions. This individual will conduct research on institutionalized transphobia at Laurier and provide recommendations for policies and procedures that promote gender equity and support trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse students, staff, and faculty. Hashtag transjustice. So, to recapitulate this list of demands, basically, they are unable to specify what they mean by transphobia. Right. Secondly, they're unable to specify incidences of violence. Thirdly, they want acknowledgement for violence, and then they want apologies for the failure to acknowledge what they cannot provide any proof for, and then they get right to the point and they just want more money and more resources, and then specific people with specific character traits to be put in positions of power. That is what they want. And good luck to them.